Lúc 2 giờ 17 phút sáng, Rowan Vale gõ tin nhắn cuối cùng của đời mình. Mẹ cô vừa mất. Tiền dồi dào đã được làm sạch tài khoản. Công ty khởi nghiệp cô bước vào năm xây dựng lắng động sau khi người đồng sáng lập biến mất toàn bộ vốn còn lại. Điện sẽ được cắt lúc bình minh và Rowan, trong căn hộ tối tăm, lạnh ngắt, gửi tin nhắn tạm thời đến số điện thoại mà cô tưởng tượng là của anh trai. Nhưng tin nhắn đó rơi vào tay Cassian DeLuca, ông trùm Mafia đáng sợ nhất Bồ Đông nước Mỹ. Nếu bạn muốn biết một tin nhắn nhầm lẫn có thể thay đổi hai cuộc đời như thế nào, hãy bấm thích, bình luận tên thành phố bạn đang xem để tôi biết câu chuyện này đã đi được bao xa và đừng tắt video.
The last thing Rowan Vale did before she made up her mind was pour the rest of the whiskey down the kitchen sink. She didn't want to be drunk for it. She wanted to be clear. She wanted to feel whatever she was going to feel without the blur softening the edges, because she had spent the last 4 months letting blurred edges lie to her, and she was done with lies. She stood at the sink in the dark, listened to the whiskey gurgle down the drain, and then she set the empty bottle on the counter with the kind of deliberate quietness that people use when they know a sound could undo them. The apartment was cold. The heat had been the first thing to go 3 weeks ago when she'd exhausted the last of what she called her emergency fund, which had never really been an emergency fund, just the money she hadn't spent yet, the buffer between herself and the truth of what her life had become. Now the cold lived inside the walls. She could feel it through her socks, through the sleeves of the oversized flannel she'd been wearing for 4 days straight. It smelled like her mother. She hadn't washed it for that reason. She sat down on the floor next to the window because she didn't want to be on the bed. The bed felt too final. The floor felt like something she'd chosen. Her phone screen glowed when she picked it up. The brightness hurt. She turned it down as far as it would go and then scrolled to her brother's name in her contacts, Marcus, and tapped it open. The last text between them was from 6 weeks ago. He'd asked if she was okay. She'd said yes. She hadn't been okay then either, but the word had come out automatically, the way it always did, because saying no felt like making a sound in a dark room that would echo back at you in shapes you weren't ready to look at. She started typing. She didn't write much. She wasn't trying to explain herself. Explanations were for situations where you still believed in the possibility of being understood, and Rowan had stopped believing in that somewhere between the afternoon she'd discovered their company bank accounts had been drained and the morning she'd stood in the funeral home trying to figure out whether she could put her mother's cremation on a card that was already 60% over its limit. She wrote what was true, that she was tired, that she was sorry, that she hoped he'd find the lease paperwork in the blue folder on the kitchen table because she didn't want him dealing with the landlord without documentation. That was the kind of person she was, even now. She was worried about the paperwork. She was worried about causing inconvenience. She was sitting on a cold floor at 2:17 in the morning trying to make things easier for the people she was leaving behind. She hit send. Then she set the phone face down on the floor beside her and pulled her knees up to her chest and listened to the silence of the building. 14 floors down, the street was empty except for a delivery truck idling at a red light. The city was doing what it always did, going on, indifferent, enormous, full of people who were sleeping or working or arguing with each other or watching television in the small, warm rectangles of their apartment windows. All those lit windows. She used to find them comforting, proof of company, even at distance. Tonight they just looked like a language she didn't speak anymore. Her phone buzzed. She didn't pick it up. She figured it was an automated response from some app, or maybe a spam message. One of those things that arrives at the worst possible moment with a coupon code or a reminder that she had unwatched content in her queue. She left it face down. It buzzed again, then again. She turned it over. The number on the screen wasn't saved in her contacts. It wasn't Marcus's number. She looked at it for a moment, confused in the abstract way of someone whose brain is operating at diminished capacity. And then she noticed it was 1 digit off from her brother's. She'd transposed 2 numbers somewhere in the dark, her fingers finding the wrong sequence, sending her last words into a stranger's phone. The messages read, "Who is this?" And then, before she could process that, "Answer me." And then, "I'm not asking again." She stared at the screen. Some part of her, the part that was still functioning, still running the basic software of being a person, registered that whoever this was, they were not gentle about it. There was no punctuation on those messages, no question marks. Just flat demands that had a certain weight to them, the kind of tone that assumed compliance as a matter of course. She almost didn't respond. What would be the point? But her thumbs moved anyway. Wrong number. Sorry. The response came back in under 10 seconds. What did you mean, you're sorry for everything? Her chest tightened. She'd written that. She'd written that she was sorry for everything, and apparently this stranger, this wrong number in the dark, had read it and was now… what? Asking. It doesn't matter, she typed. Forget you got that. I don't forget things. She almost laughed. It came out more like a breath with no warmth in it. Good for you. Where are you? That's not your business. You sent me a goodbye message at 2 a.m. Where are you? She looked up from the phone and looked out the window. The delivery truck had gone. The intersection was empty now. The light cycled through its colors for nobody. I don't know you, she typed. This was a mistake. I'm sorry I bothered you. Stop apologizing and tell me where you are. Why? There was a pause. Longer than the others. She found herself watching the screen without meaning to, watching for the 3 dots that would mean he was typing. They appeared. Then the message came. Because you sound like someone who's made a decision, and I want you to unmake it. Rowan read that 3 times. She didn't know what she'd expected. Some irritated stranger telling her to get therapy? A confused response. Maybe nothing at all. Not this. Not someone who read the things she wrote and understood it without her having to explain it. You don't know me, she typed again, but the words felt different this time. Less like a statement, more like a test. No. But I know what that message sounds like. I've written one. She went very still. Outside, far below, a car turned onto her street and its headlights swept across the ceiling of her apartment in a brief yellow arc and then disappeared. The cold settled back in. When? She typed. 14 years ago. I was 19. I didn't send it. What stopped you? Another pause. Longer. Someone knocked on the door. Cassian DeLuca was sitting in the back of a car on the VC Street Bridge when the message came through, and his first instinct, the one that had kept him alive for 38 years in an industry that disposed of people casually, was to assume it was a threat. Some new form of manipulation. Someone trying to create a moment of vulnerability that they could photograph or record or use to pull him sideways at a critical moment. He read it twice. Then he read it again. Lev Petrov, his driver and the man he trusted most in his organization, watched him in the rearview mirror without comment. Lev never commented unless asked. It was one of his better qualities. Cassian forwarded the number to his intelligence man, Nikolai, with a single instruction. Name, address, 2 minutes. Nikolai came back in 90 seconds. He always came back fast. His name was Nikolai Saab, and he was 32 years old, and Cassian had once watched him pull a full financial history on a corrupt city official using nothing but a burner phone and a cup of coffee. He was worth whatever Cassian paid him, and then some. The name came back. Rowan Vale, 31, 14th floor, Harcourt Terrace Building, West 43rd. Cassian looked at the name. He looked at the address. He looked back out at the city spread below the bridge, all those lights, the river black and indifferent between the boroughs. He thought about the message, the details of it, the lease paperwork in the blue folder, the specificity of that. People who wrote instructions about paperwork were people who were genuinely trying to make things easier for whoever came after them. That wasn't theater. That wasn't manipulation. That was someone who had thought it through and arrived at a decision with the terrible, quiet clarity of someone who had run out of other options. He'd recognized it instantly because he'd felt it once. 19 years old, a room that smelled like mildew and cigarettes, a letter on a piece of paper because he hadn't owned a phone yet. The particular silence of that night was something his body still remembered even when his mind had mostly moved past it. Some things didn't fade. They just became part of the architecture. He told Lev, West 43rd, the Harcourt building. Lev didn't ask questions. He put the car in gear. Rowan was still on the floor. She and the stranger had been texting for 11 minutes now, which was 11 minutes she hadn't expected to have. And she was aware on some level that this was happening, that time was passing, that the forward momentum of her night had been interrupted by something as stupid and accidental as a misdialed number.
She felt a dull anger about it, and underneath the anger something else, something she wasn't ready to name. He had asked her what happened. She'd told him about the company first because that was easier than the other thing. 5 years of her life poured into a startup that built financial accessibility tools for low-income families. Real work, meaningful work, the kind of work that had made her feel like her particular combination of skills and stubbornness meant something. Her co-founder was a man named Derek Holt, who had presented himself as brilliant and principled, and who had, over a period of approximately 8 months, systematically looted their operating accounts, fabricated investor documents, and then vanished to a location her lawyer described as jurisdictionally complex before she could file a civil suit. She'd lost everything. The company. The salaries she'd been personally guaranteeing for her 6 remaining employees. The office space lease she'd co-signed. $340,000 and 5 years of her life, gone. And the legal system had offered her a timeline of 12 to 18 months before anyone would even begin to hold Derek Holt accountable for any of it. And then her mother had gotten sick. She hadn't written all of that to a stranger in the dark. She'd written the shape of it, the outline, and the stranger had read it and said, "That's a lot of weight for one person." I'm sorry, not, that's terrible. Just, that's a lot of weight. She'd appreciated that more than she could explain. "What's your name?" she typed now. "Does it matter?" "Maybe not. But I'm asking. Cassian. I'm Rowan." "I know." She frowned at the screen. "How do you know?" "I'm careful about things that land on my phone at 2 in the morning." A different kind of chill moved through her. Not the cold of the apartment, something sharper. "You ran my number." "Yes." She should have felt violated by that. She did, a little, but she was also too tired to work up the full force of it. "Who are you?" "Someone who's going to knock on your door in about 3 minutes. Don't open it if you're not ready, but I'd like you to open it." Rowan lowered the phone slowly. She looked at the door to her apartment. The deadbolt was thrown. The chain was on. She'd done that automatically, habit, even tonight. Even tonight, some survival instinct in her had reached up and turned the lock. She looked back at the phone. "You're outside." "Almost." "How?" "Rowan." A pause, then, "Will you open the door?" She sat there on the cold floor for a long moment, her back against the wall under the window, the city humming faintly 14 floors below her, the darkness in the apartment complete except for the light from her phone and the blue glow of the clock on the microwave across the room that read 2:31. The knock, when it came, was quiet. Not police knock loud. Not the knock of someone who expected to be obeyed. Just 3 measured taps on the other side of her door. Patient. She stood up slowly. Her legs had gone half numb from sitting on the floor. She crossed the apartment carefully in the dark, her hand trailing along the kitchen counter to steady herself. She stopped with her hand on the deadbolt and stood there breathing. "Rowan," his voice through the door, low, unhurried. "I'm not leaving." She turned the bolt. She slid the chain free. She opened the door. The man on the other side of it was not what she'd built in her head. She'd imagined. She didn't know what she'd imagined. Something softer, maybe. Someone whose face read as safe. Instead, what she got was a man built along lines that suggested he'd been arranged by the world to withstand pressure. Dark hair, jaw that looked like it had taken a hit or two and remembered it, eyes that moved across her face in the first half second with a focus that was not unkind, but was absolutely nothing like casual. He was wearing a dark overcoat, no tie, collar of a white shirt open at the throat. He looked like someone who had been in a car doing something important and had stopped doing it to come here. He looked at her the way people looked at someone they were trying to assess quickly and honestly. She must have looked bad. She knew she looked bad. 4 days in the same flannel, hair she hadn't combed, the particular flatness around the eyes that comes from crying that's gone past the stage where it produces tears. He didn't say anything about any of that. He said, "Can I come in?" Not a question, but he waited. She stepped back. Bam. He didn't turn on the lights, and she didn't either, and they sat in the dark kitchen, her on one side of the small table, him on the other, his hands flat on the table surface in a way that she clocked as deliberate, visible, open, as unthreatening as hands like his could look. She asked him again who he was.
This time he told her. Not everything, but enough. His name, the family business, described in language that was spare and factual, and that she was smart enough to decode into what it actually meant. He watched her face while he said it, and she held her expression steady, because she'd spent enough time in rooms with difficult men to know that flinching was a kind of answer. When he finished, she said, "So you drove across the city in the middle of the night to stop a stranger from—" She stopped. Tried again. "Why?" "Because the message was real," he said. "And I've been on the other side of real." The silence between them had texture to it. She wrapped her hands around the empty coffee mug she'd been holding since before he'd arrived, the ceramic cold, and she looked at the table and then at him, and then at the window where the city pulsed on in its indifferent way. "I don't need saving," she said. And even as she said it, she understood it was the most hollow thing she'd ever spoken aloud, because she was sitting in a dark apartment at 2 a.m. with the electricity about to be cut, and her lease overdue, and a stranger across the table who had knocked on her door because she'd sent her last words to the wrong number. Cassian looked at her for a long moment. His face didn't change. "No," he said. "But maybe you need a reason to be pissed off instead of done." She looked up at him. "Derek Holt," he said. "Your co-founder." Her chest contracted. "What about him?" "I know where he is." The mug in her hands, she felt her grip on it tighten, the cold ceramic pressing into her palms. Something moved through her that was not hope exactly, but was adjacent to it, something with edges, something with heat. "You're lying," she said. "I don't lie about operational information." "Why would you know where—" "Because," he said, "when your name came up in my search results tonight, something else came up with it. Derek Holt's name is in a financial network I've been watching for 8 months. He didn't just steal from you, Rowan. He's part of something larger, and the people running it don't know yet that you have something they very badly want to get back." She stared at him. "What are you talking about?" she said. "I don't have anything." Cassian reached into the inner pocket of his coat and set a photograph on the table between them. It was a printout, a still from a security camera somewhere, grainy but legible, showing Derek Holt standing outside a building she almost recognized. A downtown address, glass and steel, the kind of place that held law offices and private equity firms on separate floors. "That building," Cassian said, "houses a shell company that's been routing money through approximately 40 small businesses in the last 3 years. Your startup was one of them. Your company's financial records, the real ones, not the ones Derek filed, contain transaction data that implicates people who are currently sitting on the boards of 2 publicly traded companies and 1 mayoral advisory committee." The room felt very still. "I filed for the records when everything fell apart," Rowan said slowly. "My attorney got copies. I have them on an encrypted drive." Something shifted in Cassian's expression. Not surprise, more like the specific look of someone whose calculation has just been confirmed. "Where's the drive?" he said. And that was when the first text came through from a number she didn't recognize. Not to her phone, but to Cassian's, which he glanced at, and then set face down on the table with a movement so controlled it frightened her more than if he'd reacted. "Rowan," he said, his voice the same, his eyes not the same at all. "Are there other copies of those records anywhere besides that drive?" "No," she said. "Why? What was that message?" He looked at her across the dark table. "Because," he said, "someone just put a man outside your building. If you or someone you know is having a difficult time, free support is available. Find resources." Cassian was already moving before Rowan finished processing what he'd said. He came around the table in 2 strides and went to the window at an angle. Not straight at it, not where someone looking up from the street could frame him in the glass, but to the side, pressing himself against the wall and using 2 fingers to pull the edge of the curtain back a 1/4 inch. Rowan watched him do it and felt something cold settle into the base of her spine that had nothing to do with the unheated apartment. He looked for maybe 4 seconds. Then he let the curtain fall. "1 man," he said. "Black sedan, passenger side, engine off. He's been there since before I arrived, or he followed me in, and I would have seen a tail, so he was already here." He turned and looked at her directly. "Which means someone knew about the drive before tonight." "That's not possible," Rowan said. Nobody knows about the drive. I didn't tell anyone. Your lawyer. She wouldn't. Your lawyer, he said again, not raising his voice, just weighting the words differently. Did she know what was on it? Rowan opened her mouth, closed it. Her attorney was a woman named Patricia Hess, who operated a two-person practice out of a midtown office and who had been recommended by a friend of a friend, and who had seemed competent and overworked in equal measure. Rowan had handed her the encrypted drive at their third meeting and explained what it contained in general terms. Patricia had photographed the exterior of the drive with her phone to document it for the case file. Her phone, Rowan said. Cassian watched her put it together. She photographed the drive, Rowan said. She said it was for documentation. She had the photo on her phone, and her practice uses a shared cloud server. She mentioned it once because she was complaining about the storage cost. Stop, Cassian said. Not harsh, just efficient. It doesn't matter how. It matters that they know it exists, and they know it's here, and they put someone outside tonight, which means they haven't moved yet, which means we have a window. He was already reaching for his phone. I need you to get the drive. Whatever else you need, you have 4 minutes. I'm not going anywhere with you. The words came out before she made a decision about them. Reflex. She heard them in the air between them and felt the truth and the stupidity of them simultaneously. Cassian stopped. He looked at her with an expression that wasn't impatience exactly, more like a man recalibrating for a variable he'd underweighted. Rowan, you walked into my apartment 20 minutes ago and told me you're what you are. And now you're telling me to grab my things and leave with you in the middle of the night because of a car outside. Do you understand why I'm not doing that? Yes, he said, and I understand you're making a reasonable assessment. But the man in that car isn't making a reasonable assessment. He's making an operational one. Those are different things. She stared at him. Her hands were flat on the table now, both of them, and she could feel the edge of the table pressing into her palms. Why do you care? She said. You don't know me. You read my name on a screen an hour ago. What is this to you? Something moved across his face. Brief. He smoothed it before she could read it completely, but she caught the edges of it. Not discomfort, more like the expression of someone touching something they don't usually allow themselves to touch. Get the drive, he said. We can have this conversation somewhere that isn't a building with a man parked outside it. Answer me first. The silence stretched. Outside, far below, a siren moved through the city and faded. Because I walked away from something like this once, he said, and the person didn't have anyone knock on their door. He held her gaze. I'm not interested in being the person who didn't knock. Now get the drive. She got the drive. She also grabbed the blue folder she'd mentioned in her text, the lease documents, out of habit, out of the same organizational reflex that had made her write about them in the first place, and her laptop and a change of clothes shoved into a canvas bag with the violent carelessness of someone who doesn't know if they're coming back. She moved through the dark apartment with Cassian stationed at the window, watching the street, his phone against his ear speaking in low-clipped sentences to someone named Lev. Side exit, he said when she came back to the kitchen. Building has a service door off the laundry room on the ground floor. My driver is coming around to the alley. How do you know about the service door? I looked at the building layout before I came up. She stared at him. You looked at my building layout. I look at the layout of every building I enter. It's not personal. It feels a little personal. Rowan. He tilted his head toward the door. Move. They took the stairs. 14 floors in near total darkness. Cassian 2 steps below her the whole way. She noticed he'd positioned himself where he could react downward if something came up from below, and she didn't know if that made her feel safer or more frightened and settled on both. Her legs were unsteady on the stairs, not from the 14 floors but from the adrenaline that had replaced whatever had been sitting in her bloodstream for the last several hours. She'd gone from one edge to another kind of edge, and her body hadn't caught up with the change in direction. The laundry room smelled like detergent and mildew. The service door opened onto a concrete alley that smelled like the city. Exhaust and damp and something organic she chose not to identify. A black car idled at the far end. Lev was behind the wheel, a broad-shouldered man of maybe 50 with a face that had been left out in the weather for decades and looked better for it. Cassian opened the rear door and she got in, and then he got in beside her and Lev put the car in gear without being asked. Rowan clutched the canvas bag in her lap and watched the alley slide past, and then the street, and then the wider city opening up around them. "Where are we going?" she said. "Somewhere safe." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have right now." She turned to look at him. In the shifting light of the city coming through the car windows, she could see his face more clearly than she had in the dark apartment, the structure of it, the set of his jaw, the way he held his body in the seat with the stillness of someone who'd learned that stillness was a form of control. There was a scar above his left eyebrow she hadn't noticed before. Small. Old. "The man in the car," she said. "What happens to him?" "Nikolai is watching him. If he moves, I'll know." "That's not what I asked." Cassian looked at her. "He'll be dealt with." "That means something specific, coming from you." "It means he'll be removed from the situation. Tonight I'm not interested in anything more complicated than that." She believed him mostly. She also understood that mostly was a significant qualifier and filed it where it needed to go. The safe house was a brownstone in a neighborhood she didn't recognize immediately. Outer Brooklyn, she thought, based on the bridge she'd seen through the car window. But the streets were unfamiliar, narrow, the buildings pressed close on both sides. The brownstone had lights on in a second-floor window and a woman at the front door who opened it before Cassian had finished climbing the front steps. The woman was maybe 60, small, with the posture of someone who had made a permanent decision about how much space they were going to take up in the world, and had settled on not much. Her name, Cassian said, was Mara. She looked at Rowan the way certain women look at things that have been brought into their space injured. Not unkind, not quite warm, just assessing. "She needs food," Mara said. "I'm fine," Rowan said. Mara looked at her with the expression of someone who had heard that specific lie from a significant number of people. "Come in." The inside of the brownstone was clean and plain and had the particular feeling of a space that was maintained rather than lived in. Everything in its place, nothing personal on the surfaces, the kind of order that serves function rather than comfort. Rowan sat at the kitchen table and Mara put a plate in front of her that she hadn't asked for, and Rowan ate it without tasting it because her body apparently had opinions about the situation that her mind hadn't been consulted on. Cassian sat across from her with his phone and a laptop that appeared from somewhere and worked with the focused silence of a man processing information. Occasionally he'd say something to Lev, who had come in from the car and stationed himself near the front window with a cup of coffee and the general energy of a boulder that had decided to take a short rest. After 20 minutes, Cassian set the laptop down. "The company that Shell routes through," he said. "Vantage Meridian Capital. You've heard of them?" "No?" "Their subsidiary placed an advertisement in 2 of your investor pitch decks from approximately 14 months ago." Rowan set down her fork. "I never pitched to them." "You didn't. But your pitch documents were in circulation. Someone who attended your investor presentations forwarded them. The advertisement was embedded in the PDF. Set that. It's a tracking method. Every time the document was opened, the location was logged." He turned the laptop to face her. "They've been watching your company since before the collapse. Derek Holt didn't approach them. They approached him." The sound of her own breathing felt suddenly very loud. "They targeted us," she said. "They targeted the data you were generating. Your company was building financial accessibility tools. That means you had transaction data, income documentation, debt structures for approximately," he checked the screen, 11,000 low-income users across 4 states. That data has a black market value that makes the operating funds Derek took look like change. Our users. Rowan felt something go very cold in her chest. Not fear. Anger, but cleaner than anger, more structural. Derek sold our users' data. Partially. The encrypted records you have contain the transaction logs from before Derek altered the books, which means your drive can prove not just the fraud, but the data sale. That implicates Vantage Meridian directly, and Vantage Meridian has investors who would prefer to remain uninvestigated. He closed the laptop. That's why the man was outside your building tonight. The kitchen was quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere upstairs, a floorboard settled. My friend Delia helped me set the encryption on that drive, Rowan said slowly. She's the only person who knows the decryption key besides me. She's a data security analyst. She did it as a favor. She stopped. She would have used her own tools, her work system. Cassian was looking at her with that same focused quiet. Where does she work? He said. She's a contractor. She cycles through firms. She was on a 6-month contract with a financial services company when she helped me. Rowan closed her eyes briefly. I don't remember the name, something with Meridian in it. I remember because I thought it sounded pretentious. The silence that followed had a particular quality. Call her, Cassian said. Right now, don't tell her where you are. Rowan already had her phone out. She pulled up Delia's number, Delia Marsh, who had been her closest friend for 7 years, who had helped her move apartments twice and had sat with her through the worst of her mother's illness, and who had spent an entire Sunday afternoon setting up military-grade encryption on a hard drive because Rowan had asked and called. It rang 4 times. Then voicemail. She called again. Same. She's not picking up, Rowan said. Text her. Say you need to talk and it's urgent. She typed it and sent it and then sat holding the phone and waiting, and the minute that passed felt like considerably longer than a minute. The reply, when it came, wasn't from Delia's number. It was from an unknown number, and it said, Your friend is safe as long as you don't do anything stupid. Bring the drive to the corner of Fulton and Water by 6 a.m. Come alone. Rowan read it, and then read it again, and then set the phone face up on the table and pushed it toward Cassian without a word, because she didn't have any words for it yet. They hadn't arrived. She was operating in the space before language, where things were just sensation and weight. Cassian read it. His expression didn't change, and that was the most frightening thing she'd seen all night. They have Delia, she said, because she needed to say it, because saying it made it real in a way that allowed her to begin being furious about it. Yes. They took her to get to me. Yes. Because of the drive. Because of what's on it. Rowan looked at the phone on the table. 6 a.m. The microwave clock on the wall of the brownstone kitchen read 3:47. She had 2 hours and 13 minutes to do what someone she'd never met told her to do. And at the end of those 2 hours and 13 minutes, the people who had systematically destroyed her company and sold her users' data and presumably orchestrated the circumstances that had led to her sitting on a cold floor 3 hours ago writing messages she thought were her last, would be holding her friend's safety as leverage. Or, she looked up from the phone. Cassian was watching her, that focused, unreadable attention. I'm not bringing them the drive, she said. Something shifted in his eyes, almost imperceptible. No, he said, you're not. But they have Delia. Yes. So we need to find her before 6. He was quiet for a moment, then, we? Rowan held his gaze. She was aware of how she looked, still in the same flannel, no sleep, the remains of whatever Mara had put in front of her on the plate beside her, her hair a disaster, her eyes probably showing every one of the hours she'd been awake. She was aware that she looked like someone who had nearly fallen apart a few hours ago and had been reassembled in a hurry. She didn't look away. You said Derek Holt's name is in a network you've been watching, she said. You've been building a case on these people. Whatever you have, I want in, because Delia wouldn't be in danger right now if it weren't for me. And I'm not sitting in this kitchen waiting for 6 a.m. to happen to me. I am done letting things happen to me. Cassian looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Lev. Something passed between them. Not words, just a look. The kind of communication that required no translation because it had been refined over years. Lev set down his coffee. Cassian opened the laptop again and turned it fully toward her this time. The screen showing a network diagram, names and companies connected by lines. Money routing through a system so tangled it looked like someone had tried to map a nervous system and given up halfway through. Vantage Meridian's operation runs through 7 shell companies, he said. They have 4 properties in the metro area that we know of. 2 are commercial addresses used for mail routing. 1 is an office space that's been empty for 6 months. The 4th, he pointed to a location marked on a satellite map, is a warehouse in Red Hook that has had consistent vehicle traffic at irregular hours for the last 3 months. He paused. Which is where I would hold someone if I needed them held quickly and quietly. Red Hook, Rowan said. That's 20 minutes from here. At this hour, 15. She looked at the map. The warehouse sat near the waterfront, surrounded by the kind of industrial sprawl that provided natural sound cover and minimal foot traffic after midnight. If you go in there wrong, Lev said from the window, his first words in over an hour, the girl doesn't come out. I know, Cassian said, and you're considering it anyway. I'm considering it because the alternative is handing them a drive full of evidence on a corner at 6 in the morning and hoping they feel generous about a witness. He looked at Lev. What would you do? Lev picked up his coffee again, drank. I'd call Petrov and Santos and Mikhail. I already texted Petrov. Cassian checked his phone. He's 7 minutes out. Rowan was already doing the math. 15 minutes to Red Hook. Whatever time they needed to assess the warehouse. Whatever margin before 6 a.m. started meaning something to the people holding Delia. There's something else, Cassian said. He said it with the specific quality of someone who has been deciding whether to say a thing and has made the decision and is now committed to it. The network diagram. Look at the bottom right. She looked. There was a name there she hadn't noticed at first because it was at the edge of the frame, connected to the Vantage Meridian node by a single line. The name had a notation next to it, internal/confirmed. The name was Vincent Caruso. She didn't know it. She looked up to say so, and she saw Cassian's face. He was looking at the screen, not at her, and the expression on his face was not the controlled neutral she'd come to recognize in the hours she'd known him. It was something older. Something that had been sitting underneath the control for a while and was pushing at the surface of it now. Who is that? She said carefully. Cassian was quiet for 3 seconds. 4. Vincent Caruso, he said, has been with my organization for 11 years. He runs our Eastern logistics operation. He has been in the room for every significant conversation I've had about this network for the past 8 months. He closed the laptop with a deliberateness that was worse than anger would have been. And apparently he's been feeding them everything. The kitchen felt different after that, smaller. How long have you known? Rowan asked. Nikolai flagged it 40 minutes ago, while we were in your apartment. He looked at her now. I've been running the confirmation in the background. And it's confirmed. Yes. She sat with that for a moment. A man he'd trusted for 11 years, in the room for every significant conversation, feeding information to the people who had destroyed her company and taken her friend and put a car outside her building. He'll know about tonight, she said. He'll know you came to find me. He might know about this location. Possibly. So we're also working against a clock on that. Yes. A car pulled up outside. Headlights swept across the kitchen wall. Lev moved to the window, checked, and made a small sound of confirmation. Cassian stood. He picked up his phone and the laptop and looked at Rowan across the kitchen. You said you're done letting things happen to you, he said. Yes. Then understand what you're stepping into. These people don't negotiate. They don't warn twice. Delia is leveraged right now, which means she's alive right now. But that status has a shelf life, and it expires the moment they decide the drive is more trouble than the people who... Rowan picked up the canvas bag. Then let's go. Petrov was younger than she'd expected. Late 20s, maybe, with a narrow face and the kind of eyes that had stopped being surprised by things some years back. He drove the second car, a gray SUV that smelled like coffee and gun oil, and he didn't look at Rowan once during the 15 minutes it took to reach Red Hook, which she interpreted as either professional discipline or the specific indifference of someone who had learned not to get attached to variables. Cassian rode with her in Lev's car. He spent the drive on the phone in a low voice, speaking to Nikolai, and what she could piece together from his half of the conversation was that Vincent Caruso had been at the Vantage Meridian office building 2 weeks ago, using a name that wasn't his, a consulting alias that Nikolai had traced back through 3 layers of documentation before it dissolved into paperwork that didn't exist. When he hung up, she asked, Does Caruso know you know? Not yet. Where is he now? His apartment. Nikolai has eyes on the building. He looked out the window at the dark Brooklyn streets sliding past. He'll stay there. He's smart enough to know that moving tonight, before 6 a.m., would flag him. He'll wait to see how it plays out. And when it plays out badly for them, he'll run. Cassian's jaw tightened slightly. He won't get far. She believed that in the cold, specific way she was beginning to believe things Cassian said, not because she trusted him completely, but because he spoke about outcomes with the flat certainty of someone who had spent years engineering them. The warehouse appeared at the end of a waterfront access road, a low concrete structure with a rusted loading dock and 3 vehicles parked at irregular angles outside it, none of them making any effort at concealment, which was itself a kind of statement. They weren't hiding because they didn't think anyone was coming. Lev cut the headlights 2 blocks out, and they rolled the last stretch in darkness. What happened next occurred in a span of 11 minutes that Rowan would later be unable to reconstruct in clean sequence. It came back to her in fragments, in sensory impressions, in the particular way that the body records events when the brain is operating too fast to file things properly. The sound of the side door going in. The smell of the warehouse interior, diesel and rust and salt air from the harbor nearby. Petrov moving ahead of them with a proficiency she didn't examine too closely. A man in a folding chair at the far end of the space who stood up too slowly and went down before he finished the motion. Another near a stack of pallets, short, controlled, nothing like what she'd imagined from the movies she'd grown up watching. Delia was in a partitioned office space at the back of the warehouse, zip-tied to a chair with a strip of tape across her mouth that she was already working her jaw against when Rowan came through the door. She was unhurt. Rowan did the scan in the first half-second, the way you did when someone you loved was in a chair with their hands tied, looking for blood or damage. And when Rowan pulled the tape free, the first thing Delia said was, "I knew you'd come. I knew it. I kept telling myself." And then she stopped and looked at Cassian standing in the doorway and said, "Who is that?" Complicated, Rowan said, and worked on the zip ties. Bumped. By 5 a.m., they were back at the brownstone. Delia had a blanket around her shoulders and a cup of tea she'd made herself because, she said, she needed to do something with her hands. She was shaking in a fine, controlled way, the kind of shaking that the body produces when adrenaline is looking for somewhere to go. She was 29 years old and she had a dry, precise way of speaking that Rowan had always loved, and right now she was using it to walk Cassian through exactly what she remembered about the men who'd taken her. 2 of them, Delia said. They came to my apartment around midnight. They didn't identify themselves. The one who talked said they needed the decryption key for a drive they described well enough that I knew exactly which one they meant. She wrapped both hands around the mug. I said I didn't know what they were talking about. They said they'd ask again when I was somewhere quieter. Did they use any names? Cassian said. He was sitting across from her, elbows on the table, his attention completely on her. Not performing attention, actually giving it. One of them got a call while we were in the car. He said, "Yes, sir," and then he said Vale, and he said she hasn't moved. So they were watching Rowan's building at the same time they were picking me up. Delia looked at Rowan. They were running 2 operations at once. Coordinated, Cassian said. They wanted to take both of you simultaneously. They didn't because, he glanced at Rowan, one of those operations went differently than they planned. By approximately 2 hours and a wrong number, Rowan said. Delia stared at her. What? Later. The drive was on the table between them. Rowan had set it there when she sat down and none of them had touched it, but it had a gravity to it, the way things do when they represent a significant quantity of consequence in a small physical form. I can decrypt it, Delia said. Here, if you have the right setup. We have the setup, Cassian said. He looked at Lev, who nodded and left the room. Walk me through what we'll find, Rowan said. She was looking at Delia, but the question was for both of them. The drive has 3 folders, Delia said. The first is your original transaction logs, the clean financial data from the company accounts before Derek started manipulating the books. The second is a folder you gave me that I didn't open. You said it was correspondence. Derek's emails, Rowan said. I pulled them off the company server the morning I figured out the accounts had been drained, before I filed anything, before I told anyone. She'd been angry that morning in a cold, methodical way, the kind of anger that made her careful rather than reckless,
and she'd spent 4 hours systematically downloading everything before calling her attorney. I didn't know what was in them. I just wanted copies before anything got deleted. And the third folder, Cassian said. Delia looked at him. The third folder is something I put there, without telling Rowan. The room went quiet. Rowan turned to look at her. When I was setting up the encryption, Delia said carefully, her hands still around the mug, the shaking finer now, more controlled. I was on my last week of a contract with a company called Meridian Venture Solutions. I didn't know at the time that it connected to anything. I didn't make that connection until much later.
But while I was working their system for a security audit, I came across a partition I wasn't supposed to access. She paused. I accessed it. Delia, Rowan said. I know. She didn't look apologetic. She looked like someone who had made a decision they'd stand behind even if it had cost them. It was a transaction record, not their official books, a second set, parallel accounting for approximately 30 months. I copied it and put it on your drive because I didn't know what else to do with it, and your drive was the safest place I had access to right then. Cassian leaned forward slightly. What was in the partition? Payments, Delia said. Outgoing, regular, coded, but not that well coded once you know what you're looking at. They were going to 11 recipients. I only traced 3 of them before I ran out of time and nerve. She looked at Cassian with her precise, careful eyes. One of them was a shell company that I've since been able to connect to a logistics operation in the Northeast. The silence stretched. Rowan watched Cassian's face. She'd been watching it for hours now, learning its vocabulary. The stillness that meant he was processing. The slight tension at the jaw that meant something had landed with weight. What she saw now was neither of those. What she saw was something she hadn't seen yet. A brief, barely visible fracture in the surface. There and gone in a second, but there. What was the shell company's name? He said. His voice was the same, completely the same. That was the thing that told her. Delia said the name. It meant nothing to Rowan. 6 words, corporate filler, the kind of name that was designed to mean nothing. But Cassian was already reaching for his phone. She found out 40 minutes later, after Delia had fallen asleep on a couch upstairs, and Lev had brought more coffee that nobody drank, and Nikolai had sent through 3 separate documents that Cassian read on the laptop with his back half turned to her. He turned around and told her. The shell company Delia had found in Meridian's parallel accounts was the same vehicle being used to pay Vincent Caruso, which they'd already known. That wasn't the thing. The thing was the payment volume. It was too large for an informant fee. It was consistent over 30 months. And when Nikolai pulled the company's registration documents and ran the beneficial ownership chain, the entity at the top of it, the one that owned the shell that was paying the shell that paid Caruso, was registered to a holding group that Cassian had created 14 years ago, under a name from his past that he'd been certain was buried. Someone in my organization built the back end of Vantage Meridian's money structure using my own infrastructure, he said. He was standing at the window, not looking out of it, just standing near it, like he needed to be vertical. They didn't just turn Caruso. They've been inside the architecture of my operation since before I started investigating this network. Which means everything I've gathered on them, every piece of intelligence, every contact I used to build the case, they knew, Rowan said. They let me build it, he said. And at some point they were going to use it to come at me. The case I thought I was making against them was also a case against me. It's been salted. 3 sources I used for verification over the past 8 months are connected to their network. The data looks clean until it doesn't. And when it stops looking clean, it stops looking clean in the direction of my operation. The size of it settled over the room. Not just a traitor, a construction. Something that had been built around Cassian's investigation, like scaffolding around a building, letting him move inside it, letting him believe he was building something, while the whole time the structure around him was designed to collapse inward on a specific signal. So the evidence on my drive, Rowan said, Derek's emails, Delia's partition data, is the only material in this situation that came from outside that scaffolding, the only data they don't control. He turned from the window. Which is why they want it so badly that they put a man outside your building and took your friend and sent a text with the 6 a.m. deadline instead of just waiting. Because they know what's on it could undo the frame. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. And Caruso, if he's been inside for this long, how much does he know about tonight? Cassian picked up his phone, looked at it. Nikolai, he said, is still showing him at his apartment. But even as he said it, his phone lit up. He looked at the screen. He said very quietly, "Get down." Rowan had approximately 1 second between that instruction and the windows of the brownstone's front room blowing inward in a controlled directional pattern. Not an explosion, a breach, the kind of forced entry that was precise and practiced and came from multiple points simultaneously. The front door, the side window, the back of the house where the kitchen was. Lev was already moving. She didn't see what he did because Cassian had her by the arm and they were going for the stairs. Not up, down. There was a basement. She hadn't known about the basement, but he knew about it because he knew the layout of every building he entered, and now she understood that wasn't paranoia. That was the reason he was still alive. The basement was unlit and smelled like concrete and old wood, and Cassian pulled the door shut above them, and she could hear, through the floor and the door and the thick dark air between, the sounds of the house being moved through. She counted boots. At least 6 people. Methodical. Professional. She pressed her back against the basement wall, and her breathing was too loud in the dark, and she put her hand over her mouth to muffle it, and next to her Cassian was completely silent, not a breath she could hear, phone screen down against his thigh so the light didn't show. The drive was in her canvas bag. The canvas bag was on her shoulder. She had not put it down when she sat at the kitchen table. She hadn't put it down because at some point in the last several hours, some survival mechanism had decided she was not putting it down. Above them, something fell. Then silence. Then a voice she hadn't heard before, carrying through the floor in the flat, specific tone of someone transmitting information. Main floor clear. Target not present. Basement access on the east wall. Cassian's hand found her wrist in the dark. Not grip, contact. Something to navigate by. She felt him move. She moved with him. The basement had a second door. Of course it did. He'd had it, and he knew it, and it opened onto a shaft that smelled like the city's underside, concrete and water and old brick, and they went through it in total darkness, with his hand on her arm and the sound of the east wall door beginning to open behind them. And Rowan understood in that moment with complete and awful clarity that they had lost the safe house, lost the infrastructure, lost whatever operational ground Cassian had spent years building. And above them in the city, Vincent Caruso was no longer sitting in his apartment because Nikolai's message had just come through on Cassian's phone in a single word, visible in the dark as they moved. Gone. The shaft let them out into an alley 2 buildings east of the brownstone, a narrow gap between structures that smelled like standing water and decades of city residue, and Cassian came out first and swept the alley in both directions before pulling Rowan through after him. She scraped her shoulder on the door frame and felt it, and didn't stop moving. The canvas bag was still on her shoulder. Cassian had his phone out, walking fast, typing one-handed, not looking at the screen. The alley opened onto a side street, and he turned left without hesitating, pulling her into the natural shadow of a building overhang, and she matched his pace because there was no version of this moment where she didn't. "Lev," she said, "I know." "Is he—" "I don't know yet." His voice was even. She understood by now that even didn't mean calm, it meant managed. "Keep moving." She kept moving. 3 blocks. 4. The streets were empty in the particular way of pre-dawn Brooklyn, the occasional car, a bodega with lights on behind glass. Nobody at the right angle to watch them. Cassian turned twice without explanation, and she understood he was doing something about patterns, breaking the line of movement, making them harder to track from above or from a vehicle running parallel. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. "Lev's out," he said. Santos and Mikhail held the front long enough. Something in her chest unclenched a fraction. She hadn't known it was clenched. They stopped in the doorway of a laundromat that was closed and dark, and Cassian made 2 calls in rapid succession, and she stood beside him and watched the street and tried to organize her breathing into something that didn't sound like panic. Her shoulder ached where she'd caught the door frame. She pressed her palm against it, and that helped a little. The situation as it now stood was this. The brownstone was burned, Caruso had run, The people running Vantage Meridian's enforcement arm had just demonstrated they could locate and breach a safe house in under 4 hours, and the 6 a.m. deadline was now 41 minutes away. The encrypted drive was in her bag. Delia, who had been asleep upstairs when the breach happened, was somewhere Rowan didn't know. "Delia," she said. Cassian was already on it. He spoke to someone, Petrov, she thought from the tone, and asked a question in a low voice. He listened. His expression didn't change, but his shoulders did. A very small adjustment she was only catching because she'd been watching him for hours. "She got out the back with Santos," he said. "She's in a car. She's okay." Rowan let out a breath that had been sitting in her lungs for what felt like several minutes. "Okay," she said. "Okay." She let herself have 2 seconds of that, and then she put it away. Caruso. He ran, which means he knows we know, which means he's going to whoever he reports to. Yes. Which means whoever runs Vantage Meridian is going to know their 6 a.m. plan failed, and they're going to move to whatever comes next. Yes. What comes next? Cassian looked at her. They stop waiting, and they start eliminating. The drive becomes less important than the people who know what's on it. She absorbed that. So we can't wait. No. Where do we take the data? He had been thinking about this. She could tell by the speed of his answer. I have a contact at the FBI field office, separate from anything Caruso knew about. I've kept this contact outside my organization entirely. A direct line. Nothing in writing, no third parties. He met her eyes. I built it for exactly this kind of situation. For the day my own house stopped being trustworthy. 14 years of planning for the day someone betrayed you from the inside. He didn't respond to that. She hadn't really expected him to. We get the data to your contact, she said, but the drive is encrypted. Delia is the only one with the full decryption key. Then we need Delia. Where's the car she's in? 12 minutes from here. He was already texting the location. There's a place, a diner on Atlantic Avenue, been there 40 years. Owner is someone who owes me a significant debt and has never once asked me to explain it. We can use the back room. She followed him back into the street. The diner was called Manny's, and it had the particular amber light of places that haven't updated their bulbs since the 80s, and the smell of coffee that had been burning on a hot plate since before either of them were born. The owner, a man of approximately 70 with the name Manny, plausibly earned rather than inherited, opened the back door at Cassian's knock without a word and pointed them down a hallway to a room with a table and 4 chairs and a working outlet, and then went back to his counter and his coffee. Petrov arrived 6 minutes later with Delia, who came through the door with the compressed energy of someone who had been awake for hours under circumstances that did not allow for processing. She looked at Rowan and then looked at the room and then sat down and put her hands flat on the table. The drive, she said. Rowan set it in front of her. Delia had the decryption running in 9 minutes. She worked without speaking, her jaw set, her hands completely steady in a way that Rowan recognized. This was how Delia handled things that frightened her. She went precise. She went technical. She narrowed her entire attention down to the task, because the task was controllable and everything surrounding it was not. Cassian stood near the door with his phone and worked his contact at the FBI. Not a call. She understood from his side of it that this was a protocol they'd established, a specific channel, texts with a format that meant something particular. He was moving quickly but not rushed, the way someone moves when they've rehearsed the scenario enough times that urgency doesn't interrupt function. Rowan opened Derek's emails on the laptop Petrov had produced from a bag that seemed to contain most of what a person might need in a situation like this one. She'd looked at some of these before. She'd pulled the files in the immediate aftermath of the fraud, when she was still in the phase of needing to confirm that what she thought had happened had actually happened. She'd found enough to make her sick, and then she'd encrypted them and given them to Delia and tried not to think about them because thinking about them had the effect of making her want to put her fist through walls. Now she read them differently. Now she was reading for names. They were there. Not obvious. Derek had been careful enough to use partial names, initials, references that required context to decode. But she'd had 5 years in a company with this man, and she knew his writing patterns. She knew his abbreviations. She knew that when he wrote VM directorship, He meant something specific, and when he wrote the arrangement per RC, she could now put a face to those initials and feel the specific cold clarity of having a piece of the picture lock into place. R.C. Raymond Colt, chairman of the investment committee of Vantage Meridian Capital, whose name she had seen in the network diagram on Cassian's laptop, connected to the center of the web. She pulled the relevant emails into a separate folder, 12 of them spanning 14 months, constituting a paper trail from Derek Holt to Raymond Colt to the data sale to the shell structure to the financial fraud. Not complete, not by itself, but in combination with Delia's partition data and the transaction logs, a case that she could see even without a legal degree was substantial enough to make people run. "I have it," she said. Cassian crossed the room and looked at the screen over her shoulder. She could feel him reading, tracking, the stillness of it. His breathing was even. "The emails go to my contact along with the partition data," he said. "I need Delia to generate a summary of the accounting irregularities she found in the partition. Plain language, not technical, something a federal agent can walk into a briefing with." 20 minutes, Delia said without looking up. 15, he said. Delia made a sound that was not agreement, but was also not refusal. Rowan looked at the time on the laptop screen. 5:38 a.m. 22 minutes until the deadline that no longer meant anything because they were not going to a corner on Fulton and Water with a drive. They were burning the drive's contents to a federal contact in a diner on Atlantic Avenue, and the people who'd set that deadline were going to find out in very short order that their window was closed. That was when she understood the problem. "Raymond Colt," she said. Cassian looked at her. "He's going to know this is coming before it lands," she said, Massam. "Not because of Caruso, because of the timing. It's been 45 minutes since the breach. He knows the 6 a.m. exchange isn't happening. He's going to move assets. He's going to move himself. He's going to make calls that close off the investigation before the data reaches anyone who can act on it." She turned in her chair to look at Cassian directly. "How long does it take for your FBI contact to get a warrant moving?" "Hours. Best case." "Colt can be on a private flight in 90 minutes. The room held that for a moment. Petrov, who had been standing near the back wall with his arms crossed and his coffee cup, said, "There's another way to hold him in place." Cassian looked at him. "Make him think the exchange is still happening," Petrov said. "Give him the 6 a.m. deadline. Give him something to wait for." "We don't have a body to put on that corner," Cassian said. "We don't need one that's very convincing. We just need one that creates enough uncertainty that he doesn't move for another 2 hours." Petrov looked at Rowan, not unkindly. Someone who fits her general description, carrying her bag, making contact at the location. He'll wait to see it confirmed before he moves. These people are careful. They verify. The table went quiet. Rowan felt the shape of what Petrov was suggesting settle into the room. "No," Cassian said. "Cass, no, I'm not putting someone on a corner as a target. I wasn't suggesting someone unwilling." Petrov's eyes moved back to Rowan. "I'll do it," Rowan said. Cassian turned to look at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him. Not the controlled neutral, not the managed calm. Something more fundamental than that. Something that had a strong opinion and was working against expressing it. "You will not," he said. "Listen to me." She stood up. "The data goes to your contact. That takes time. Colt needs to not move for 2 hours. I go to the corner. I show up with the bag. I make whoever is waiting at Fulton and Water think the exchange is on. I buy you time." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not doing this because you asked me to. I'm doing this because Delia is sitting at that table because of me, and 11,000 people's data was sold because of me, and I spent 5 years building something that got turned into a weapon, and I am done being the person this happened to. I'm going to be the person who ends it." The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Cassian looked at her with that look she couldn't fully read, and then he looked at Petrov, and then he looked at the floor briefly, and she could see him running the calculation. The risk, the timeline, the variables, the alternative scenarios, all of it moving through him at the speed of a man who had spent his adult life making decisions in rooms where the wrong choice had permanent consequences. "You don't go alone," he said. I know. You go with me. I know. And you do exactly what I tell you when I tell you. On this specific point, she said. Yes. Petrov pushed off from the wall and went to make a call. Delia, who had been listening with the precise stillness of someone cataloging every word, looked at Rowan over the top of the laptop screen. Finish the summary, Rowan said to her. Get it to his contact. I will, Delia said, and then, very quietly, be careful. Rowan picked up the canvas bag. Get me something that looks like a drive. Anything small and rectangular. Petrov came back in and set a USB stick on the table. Silver, slightly different shape, close enough in the dark at 30 meters. She put it in the bag. Fulton and Water was a corner in lower Manhattan that at 5:57 in the morning had the particular emptiness of a place waiting for the city to arrive. The financial district was 15 minutes from its first commuters. The streets were clean and gray, and the harbor light was beginning to separate the sky from the water in the east, a thin line of differentiation that wasn't quite dawn yet. Cassian had parked 2 blocks north. Lev, who had arrived at the diner with a bruised jaw and a torn jacket and said nothing about either, was on the east side. Petrov held the south. 2 others she'd been introduced to only by surname were at angles she'd been shown on a rough map drawn on a napkin. She walked to the corner alone. The contact was already there. She identified him from Cassian's description. Medium height, dark jacket. The particular stance of someone who had been trained to look like they weren't watching a corner while watching a corner. He was younger than she'd expected. He had a phone in his hand, and when she came around the corner, he looked at her and then looked at the bag. She stopped 5 feet from him. You have something for me, he said. Not a question. Where's my friend? She said. She's safe. The drive. Not until I know she's with someone I trust. He looked at her with the flat patience of someone used to negotiating under time pressure. We confirmed release. Check your phone. She didn't reach for her phone. She held his gaze and kept her hand on the bag strap and thought about what Cassian had told her on the walk from the car. Make him wait. Make him confirm. Make him feel like he's managing you rather than the other way around. Because people who think they're managing you don't move. I want to hear her voice, Rowan said. That's not how this works. It is how this works. I don't hand anything to anyone until I hear Delia Marsh's voice. The man's jaw tightened. He reached for his phone and made a call and spoke low into it and then held the phone out to her. The voice on the other end was Petrov, running the script they'd agreed on, a woman's voice playing from a recording on his phone, Delia having spoken it 15 minutes ago in the diner's back room. I'm okay. Make the exchange. Rowan took a breath, made herself hesitate just long enough to be believable. She reached into the bag. She felt her hand close around the USB stick. The wrong one, the empty one, the silver rectangle that looked enough like the drive they wanted when pulled from a bag in the pre-dawn gray. She held it between her fingers. The man across from her extended his hand. And that was when every remaining thing went wrong at once. The sound came from the south, so not a gunshot, a vehicle, a black SUV that came up Fulton faster than it should have been moving and jumped the curb, and Petrov was not at his position anymore. Petrov's line had gone silent 4 minutes ago, and she hadn't known because she wasn't on comms. She was standing on a corner with a fake drive in her hand, and the SUV stopped 10 feet from her, and the doors opened, and the man who got out of the passenger side was not someone from Vantage Meridian's enforcement arm. He was Vincent Caruso. She knew his face from the photograph she'd seen for 30 seconds on Cassian's laptop, but she would have known him anyway. There was something about the way he moved, the particular confidence of someone who has spent years inside a structure that trusted him and has never stopped benefiting from that trust. He was 50, compact, wearing a jacket over a dark shirt, and he walked toward her with the body language of someone arriving to conclude something. Miss Vale, he said. Don't. She didn't know what he was telling her not to do. She hadn't moved. The drive, he said. The real one, not whatever you're holding. Her hand tightened on the USB stick. She kept her face still. Cassian's not in position anymore, Caruso said. His people on the east side are contained. I want the drive, and I want the laptop with the decrypted files, and I want the friend who did the decryption,
and then this is over. He stopped 5 feet from her. You're smart. You've survived a lot of stupid things tonight by being smart. Be smart now. The man in the dark jacket, Vantage Meridian's contact, had moved to her left. She was between them. Raymond Colt sent you personally, she said. Raymond Colt doesn't send me anywhere, Caruso said. That's not how our arrangement works. She filed that away, kept him talking. What did 11 years get you? Something moved across his face. Not guilt. She'd been wrong to look for guilt. Something colder. The specific expression of a man who had long ago converted regret into justification and now lived entirely in the justification. More than 11 years in Cassian's organization was ever going to. He trusted you. Yes. He held out his hand. The drive. In her peripheral vision, on the north end of the block, she saw a figure that hadn't been there 10 seconds ago, moving along the wall of a building at an angle that was not random. She didn't look directly at it. She kept her eyes on Caruso. She knew the walk. There's something you should understand, she said to Caruso, making her voice careful and flat. The data was transmitted 40 minutes ago. FBI contact, direct line, nothing you knew about because Cassian kept it outside everything you had access to. She watched his face. You've been containing the wrong problem all night. The drive in this bag doesn't matter anymore. It's already... Caruso moved toward her, and Cassian came off the building wall from the north with the specific velocity of a man who had been waiting for the precise second when the other man's attention was fully committed to something else. And the sound of the impact when he reached Caruso carried the kind of finality that required no translation. And Rowan dropped flat against the sidewalk because she'd been told to drop when she heard him move, and she had listened to exactly that instruction. The contact in the dark jacket grabbed for her. She rolled. The canvas bag caught under her, and she came up on one knee with the bag clutched against her chest, and Lev was there. Lev, whose east side position she'd been told was contained, who had apparently not been as contained as Caruso believed, and the contact went down and didn't get up. The SUV tried to move. Petrov's car came from the alley and blocked it. The dawn was coming in from the harbor in that flat, gray, indifferent way that doesn't care what happened in the dark. She could see it over the roofline of the buildings to the east, the sky separating into colors that hadn't been there 10 minutes ago. Cassian had Caruso against the hood of the SUV with a hand between his shoulder blades and his phone in his other hand, and he was speaking into it. Not to Caruso, to someone else, and she heard enough to understand that the two men on the south side who'd contained Petrov had been recontained and were now having a different kind of conversation with the people she hadn't yet met. She stood up. Her knees were shaking, and her shoulder was still aching from the doorframe in the basement, and she had not slept in. She couldn't count the hours anymore. They'd stopped being hours and started being events. She stood on Fulton Street in the early gray of a morning that smelled like the harbor, and she held the canvas bag and she looked at Caruso pinned against the hood and felt something in her chest that was not satisfaction, not yet, but was adjacent to it. Something with mass. Cassian looked up from his phone. Across the distance between them, he looked at her and she looked at him, and the city did what it always did, which was go on around them without comment. Caruso lifted his head from the hood. His face was sideways, cheek against the metal, and he looked at her with eyes that had moved through their calculation and arrived at something that might have been respect if the circumstances had been different. The transmission, he said, was that real? She looked at him. Rowan, Cassian said. A warning in it, not to answer. She answered anyway. What do you think? Caruso closed his eyes, which told her everything. Because a man who knew for certain that the transmission had happened would not close his eyes in that particular way. He would calculate. He would pivot. He was closing his eyes because he didn't know, because the uncertainty was the thing he couldn't operate inside of. Because for all his 11 years of positioning and all the infrastructure he'd helped build and all the intelligence he'd fed to the people who paid him better than Cassian did, he was at the end of a night that had not gone the way anyone planned. And he was looking at a woman he'd underestimated at every turn, and he did not know what was on the other end of that uncertainty. Sirens, somewhere to the north, coming closer. Cassian came off the hood and put something on Caruso's wrists and turned toward her. His face was cut above the cheekbone,
She hadn't seen it in the dark, a clean line that was bleeding in the flat dawn light. He walked to her and stopped and looked at her, and then at the bag. "The real drive," he said. She reached into the bag and gave it to him. He held it for a moment. 11,000 people's data, 5 years of her life, the financial architecture of a network that had been eating through legitimate businesses for 3 years, and her friend's stolen evidence from a company that hadn't known what it was housing, all of it in a rectangle the size of a thumb. He passed it to Lev. "The transmission," she said. "Was it actually real?" He looked at her. "Delia sent the files at 5:42. So what I told Caruso was the truth." Something almost crossed his face. "You didn't know that when you told him." "No," she said. "But it seemed like a good time to try." The sirens were on Water Street now. She could see the lights beginning to paint the buildings at the end of the block in rotating red and blue, the colors of consequence arriving on schedule. Cassian looked at her in the dawn light with that cut above his cheekbone and the controlled remains of a night that had dismantled most of what he'd built, and she looked back at him, and neither of them had words for the moment yet, which seemed right because the moment wasn't finished. Caruso was zip-tied to an SUV on Fulton Street, and Raymond Colt was somewhere in the city, not yet knowing that the night had already ended without him, and the data was in transit to a federal contact who was about to have a very long morning. Cassian's phone rang. He looked at the screen and answered it and said 2 words. "Go ahead," and then listened with that complete stillness, and Rowan watched his face and saw the moment the information landed, saw the way it settled into him, not as relief, but as something heavier and more permanent than relief. He hung up. "Colt," he said. "They have him." He looked at her. "They have him." Saw. Raymond Colt had been arrested at 6:04 a.m. in the parking structure of a private aviation terminal in Teterboro, New Jersey, 17 minutes after his driver had been rerouted by a federal agent with a badge and a calm voice and a piece of paper that had Colt's name at the top of it. The arrest was quiet, which was how federal arrests of men with significant resources tended to go. Not because those men deserved quiet, but because the agents had been told to avoid anything that would give a defense attorney a procedural opening. And so Raymond Colt had been asked to step out of a black car in a parking structure and had been informed of his rights in the flat, factual tone of someone reciting something they had memorized, because precision mattered more than drama. Rowan learned these details later, in pieces, over the course of a morning that she would remember as the strangest of her life, not because of what happened in it, but because of the texture of it. The way time moved differently once the urgent thing was over, slower and thicker, like the difference between water and something that had not yet decided what it was. At 6:20, she was sitting in the back of Lev's car with a cup of coffee someone had produced from somewhere and a blanket that smelled like car interior, watching the city come to life around her through the window. The financial district filling in, the early commuters, the delivery trucks, the specific democracy of a city morning that has no interest in the night that preceded it. Delia was in the front seat. She had come from the diner in Petrov's car and arrived at the aftermath on Fulton Street and looked at the scene. The SUV, the men, the rotating police lights, Rowan on the sidewalk with a canvas bag, and had said nothing for approximately 30 seconds before saying, "I'm going to need significantly more tea." They were both still in the car now, not talking, just existing in the same space in the particular companionable exhaustion of people who have been through something together and don't yet have language for it and are not trying to find any. Cassian was outside the car, 30 feet away, speaking to 2 federal agents. She watched him through the glass. He stood the way he always stood, contained, deliberate, giving nothing away that he hadn't decided to give. But she could read something in the set of his shoulders now that she hadn't been able to read 8 hours ago, some weight there that was not the weight of the current situation. It was older, 11 years. She kept coming back to that. Vincent Caruso had been in his organization for 11 years, and he had not known, not suspected with enough conviction to act, and she understood from the architecture of the night they'd been through what that cost. Not the operational damage, not the compromised intelligence, but the other thing, the thing that didn't have a clean name. The specific damage of being trusted by someone who is using your trust as a resource.
She knew something about that.
The full accounting of the night took days to resolve into something coherent and months to resolve into something final. In the immediate aftermath, Vincent Caruso was processed and held without bail based on a federal complaint that listed 23 separate charges, the most significant of which involved conspiracy to commit wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and accessory to criminal enterprise, the last of which was specific enough in its language to indicate that the federal contact had received the transmitted files and found them useful. Caruso's attorney, who arrived at the federal building at 8 a.m. in a suit that suggested he'd been on retainer for exactly this scenario, filed 3 motions in the first 2 hours and succeeded with none of them. Raymond Colt retained 2 attorneys and said nothing in his initial interview, which was his right, and which the agents had expected. The files transmitted from the diner at 5:42 a.m. were, according to Cassian's contact, a woman named Agent Dora Selleck, whom Rowan met briefly on the sidewalk outside the federal building and who had the compressed efficiency of someone who had not slept and did not require sympathy about it, sufficient to support a grand jury subpoena for Vantage Meridian Capital's full financial records within 72 hours. Derek Holt was apprehended by authorities in a jurisdiction that Rowan's attorney had previously described as complex, extradited over a period of 6 weeks, and arraigned on a separate but related set of charges that included wire fraud, theft of fiduciary assets, and unauthorized sale of personally identifiable data. He had lost considerable weight. He did not look at Rowan in the courtroom on the day of his arraignment, which she noted and filed away as information about the kind of person he was and had always been. Patricia Hess, Rowan's attorney, whose cloud-connected phone had inadvertently photographed the drive and placed that image in a system accessible to Vantage Meridian's surveillance operation, was not charged. She was, however, the subject of a state bar inquiry regarding her data security practices, the outcome of which was a formal recommendation that resulted in new protocols at her practice. She called Rowan twice to apologize. Rowan took the first call and let the second go to voicemail and played it once and did not call back, which was, she decided, the appropriate amount of closure for that particular situation. Delia Marsh took 2 weeks off work and spent most of them at Rowan's apartment, which now had electricity and heat because Rowan had paid the outstanding bills from the Emergency Assistance Fund that Cassian's organization had placed in her account on the morning after the night that everything had happened. The amount had been specific, enough to cover the outstanding utilities and 2 months of rent, no more, and there had been no discussion about it. It had simply appeared. And when Rowan called the number she had for Cassian and said, the money, he had said, consider it operational expenses. And she had considered saying more and decided against it. She paid it back 3 months later in full when the first tranche of restitution was released. The restitution came from the asset seizure tied to Vantage Meridian's accounts, a process that took several months and involved 2 civil proceedings and 1 federal ruling. And when Rowan's attorney called to tell her the figure, Rowan had been standing at her kitchen counter making coffee, and she had to sit down on the floor because her legs made a decision she wasn't consulted on. Not because the number was large. It was not as large as the 5 years. Nothing was going to be as large as the 5 years, and she had made a certain peace with that. She sat on the kitchen floor and drank her coffee and thought about the difference between what could be returned and what couldn't, and she decided that floor was a reasonable place to make that distinction, having made a few significant decisions on floors before. She saw Cassian 3 times in the weeks that followed the night. The first time was at a federal building, in a waiting room with beige walls and chairs designed for function rather than the possibility of anyone sitting comfortably in them for an extended period. They were both there to give separate statements. They arrived at the same time, which was not planned, and sat in adjacent chairs for 40 minutes waiting for their respective interviews, and talked about almost nothing. The coffee from the machine in the corner, which was terrible, and the weather, which was moving into the first cold front of the season, and a news story about a bridge in Ohio that neither of them particularly cared about, but that provided the structure for a conversation that was really about something else. When she was called in before him, she stood and picked up her bag and looked at him, and he looked back at her with that focused attention that she had learned over the course of the night meant he was paying complete attention to the specific thing in front of him and not managing it. "Thank you," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Don't. I'm going to anyway. I know. The corners of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. The topography of an expression that had been in storage for a while and wasn't certain yet of its own dimensions. Go give your statement. She gave her statement. It took 2 hours and 20 minutes, and a federal agent named Carver, who asked the same questions from multiple angles with the patience of someone who understood that patience was a professional tool. She answered everything. She was specific and she was accurate. And when Carver asked her to characterize her relationship with Cassian DeLuca, she said complicated. And then, because she'd decided the word was accurate, she said it again. The second time she saw Cassian was at a restaurant, not planned by either of them, both of them arriving separately to meet different people. She was with Delia. He was with Lev, which somehow surprised her less than it might have. They acknowledged each other across the room with the specific contained knot of people who have shared significant territory and have not yet figured out what to do with the knowledge of each other that they now carry. He left before she did. When she was putting her coat on, the waiter brought a bottle of wine to their table. The particular bottle she'd looked at the menu and not ordered because she was, as she always was, adding up numbers in her head, and said it was from the gentleman who'd been sitting across the room. Delia looked at the bottle and then at Rowan with the expression of someone filing information in a folder labeled for later examination. Complicated, Delia said. Yes, Rowan said. How complicated? I haven't figured that out yet. Delia poured 2 glasses. Let me know when you do. The third time she saw him was 6 weeks after that, and it was not accidental. She called his number on a Tuesday morning in November, standing at her window looking out at a city that had gone gray and cold with the season, and when he picked up, she said, Are you still in the city? Yes. I want to show you something. If you have an hour. He was quiet for a moment. Where? She told him the address. Dead. The space was in a building in the West Village that had been a textile warehouse in a previous life, and had the high ceilings and wide windows and raw brick of its industrial history. Rowan had signed a short-term lease on the ground floor. The space was empty except for 4 folding tables pushed against one wall, and 2 laptops and a whiteboard that had a series of diagrams on it that were halfway between a business plan and an argument. She walked him through it. The foundation she was building, she didn't have a name for it yet, was still turning names over in her mind. Would work with people in the specific situation she had been in. Not exactly, no 2 situations were exactly the same, but the shape of it. Financial devastation caused by fraud, or institutional failure, or the kind of collapse that left people in the gap between what the legal system could do in 12 to 18 months and what they needed in the next 12 to 18 days. Emergency legal navigation, financial triage, connection to resources that actually existed rather than the resources that were theoretically available but required a level of stability to access that people in crisis rarely had. She'd spent 3 weeks talking to social workers, to attorneys who worked financial crime cases, to a woman who ran a nonprofit in the Bronx that did adjacent work, and who had given Rowan 2 hours and a yellow legal pad full of notes, and said, the main thing people need is someone who already knows how the system eats people, who can tell them where the teeth are. That was the phrase she'd written on the whiteboard, where the teeth are. Cassian stood in the middle of the empty space and looked at the whiteboard and looked at the tables and looked at her. You need funding, he said. I have some. The restitution covers the first year of operating costs if I'm careful. I have 2 attorneys who've agreed to provide pro bono hours. I have Delia, who is building the data security framework. And after the first year. I'll figure out after the first year when it's the first year. She held his gaze. I didn't bring you here to ask for money. I know. I brought you here because... She stopped, tried to find the sentence. Because you knocked on a door, and I know that sounds small, but it wasn't small, and I wanted you to see what happened because of it. The space held that. The empty brick and the gray November light through the high windows and the whiteboard with the diagram of something that didn't exist yet, but was going to. Cassian looked at the whiteboard for a long moment. The name, he said. You said you don't have one. Not yet. What's the thing you most needed that night? She thought about it. The floor, the dark, the silence of the building, and then the quiet knock that interrupted it. Someone to answer, she said. He nodded slowly. Not at her. At something internal, some recognition that had found its correspondence. Then call it that, he said. Something that means that. She called it the signal. The paperwork was filed in December. The first intake coordinator was hired in January, where a woman named Bess, who had a background in crisis social work and a voice that carried the specific warmth of someone who had decided that warmth was a professional value, not a liability. The office furniture came from a second-hand place in Greenpoint, and nothing matched, and Rowan decided she didn't care because the mismatched furniture looked like something assembled by people who were trying, which was accurate. The first person through the door was a man named Arthur Vega, 44 years old, a contractor whose small business had been defrauded by a payment processing company that had since dissolved and whose assets had been structured in such a way that made standard legal recourse essentially inaccessible to someone in Arthur's financial situation. He had 3 employees he hadn't been able to pay in 6 weeks. He sat across from Rowan in her office, which had 1 real chair and 1 folding chair and a lamp she'd brought from her apartment, and told her his situation with the specific flatness of someone who has had to tell the same story many times and has had to drain the emotion out of it in order to keep telling it. She listened to all of it. Then she told him exactly where the teeth were. Vincent Caruso pled guilty in March to 6 of the 23 charges, the result of a cooperation agreement that his attorney negotiated over a period of weeks, and that required him to provide testimony regarding Vantage Meridian's internal structure and the identities of 3 additional individuals connected to the network who had not been initially charged. He was sentenced to 9 years. The federal guidelines had allowed for as little as 4, given the cooperation agreement, and the judge cited the duration and deliberateness of the breach of trust in the sentencing statement. Cassian was not in the courtroom. He didn't need to be. Rowan was not in the courtroom either. She was at the signals office, running a workshop for 7 people who needed to understand how to document financial harm in a format that was legible to legal systems that had not been designed to make it easy. She heard about the sentencing from Delia, who texted her a single number and nothing else. She read it, acknowledged it, and went back to the workshop. Raymond Colt's trial took most of the following year. She followed it the way you follow something that matters but is no longer the center of anything. At a distance, checking in on the significant days, allowing the legal process to be what it was, which was slow and thorough and indifferent to the emotional timeline of the people it affected. Colt's attorneys were excellent. They were also working with material that the 5:42 a.m. transmission had substantially complicated, and the final verdict, when it came, was 12 counts including conspiracy, securities fraud, and obstruction. He was 71 years old, and the sentence was structured in a way that his attorneys would continue to challenge, but the asset seizure that accompanied it was complete, and the 11 companies that had routed money through Vantage Meridian's structure were unwound over a period of months, and the restitution pool that resulted from that unwinding reached 214 individuals and entities, of whom Rowan was one and Arthur Vega, through a separate but parallel proceeding, was also eventually one. She didn't celebrate when she heard the verdict. She was in her office, which had real furniture now, 2 actual chairs, and she sat at her desk and looked out the window at the street below and let herself feel the full weight of what the verdict meant, which was not simple and was not clean and was not the kind of satisfaction that the movies suggested justice produced. It was more complicated than that. It was the specific complicated thing of watching something that had been done to you be named officially as wrong, and understanding that the naming didn't give back the 5 years or her mother's last months or the night on the floor in a dark apartment, but that the naming was still worth something. It was worth something. She sat with that for a while. Then she went back to work. Well, Cassian DeLuca spent the year in a process that he described to her once, briefly, as restructuring, which she understood to mean something considerably more involved than the word suggested. The organization he ran, inherited and shaped over nearly 2 decades, was not something that could be converted to legitimacy the way you converted a file from one format to another. It was something more like a building that needed to be taken down carefully, load-bearing wall by load-bearing wall, while simultaneously building something else in an adjacent space. Some of it was legal compliance work. Some of it was the quieter business of ending arrangements that couldn't be made compliant, and doing so in a manner that minimized the cascading consequences that those endings tended to produce. He didn't talk to her about the details of it. She didn't ask. They had arrived at a specific understanding of what they shared and what they didn't, and it worked. And she was not interested in disturbing something that worked in order to understand it better. What she knew was this. He showed up to the Signal's first anniversary event in November, wearing a jacket over a dark shirt, collar open, the scar above his left eyebrow unchanged, a bottle of wine that was not the one from the restaurant menu, but was better. And he stood at the edge of the room and watched the space fill up with the people who had built it, and the people who had come through it, and the people who were going to come through it, and she crossed the room to him and stood beside him, and they looked at the room together. Bess cried at the intake meeting this morning, she said. Arthur brought his whole crew. They're doing well. New contract. I heard, he said. From who? I keep up. She looked at him sidelong. You keep up. It's a habit. He looked back at the room. The name is good. The Signal. It took me 3 weeks. Worth it. She accepted a glass from a passing tray, and he took one as well, and they stood in a room that smelled like other people's warm conversation and the specific promise of a thing that was working. And she thought about the text message she'd sent at 2:17 a.m. on a night that felt both very far away and very close, depending on where she stood when she looked at it. Wrong number. Right person. The math of accidents that don't stay accidents. I have a question, she said. Yes. You've been supporting 2 of our pro bono attorneys. They're firms. I looked at the funding structure. It routes through a consulting entity that doesn't exist yet in any directory I can find. He said nothing. I told you I didn't bring you to that empty space to ask for money. You didn't, he said. I made a separate decision. Cassian. He turned to look at her. The room continued around them, the noise and the warmth, the mismatched furniture visible through the interior window of her office where she'd left the light on. You said you wanted to show me what happened because of someone knocking on a door, he said. I'm showing you what happens when someone opens it. She held his gaze. The things she'd said to him on the corner on Fulton Street in the pre-dawn gray, I am done letting things happen to me, had been true then and was true now, but it was also incomplete, which was something she'd come to understand over the months between that corner and this room. Done letting things happen to her was a beginning. It was the necessary first step, the refusal, the floor you stopped lying on because the floor was not where you were meant to stay. But it was not a destination. The destination was harder to name and took longer to arrive at, and had something to do with the room behind her, and the man standing beside her, and the particular willingness to remain inside a complicated thing rather than simplifying it. She had spent a year building something instead of ending something. The distinction mattered. The attorneys keep the arrangement, she said, under one condition. What condition? Quarterly lunch, you, me, Bess, Arthur, no intermediaries. I want you in the room seeing what it's doing. He was quiet for a moment. That's not much of a condition. It's the one I want. The room filled around them with the sound of people who had reasons to be there, and she raised her glass and he raised his, and they didn't say anything else because there wasn't anything else that needed saying right now, which was its own kind of resolution, the kind that doesn't announce itself, doesn't underline itself, just settles in quietly like the end of a long weather system, like the harbor going still after a hard night on the water. Outside, the city did what the city always did. The light in her office stayed on.